Fatigue crept in sometime around dawn, wrapping itself around him like a sticky, invisible shroud, as sleep's betraying embrace tugged him toward oblivion. If not for everyone, then for many. This is the truth. An unspoken bond among those who live on the edge of exhaustion. Ask any surgeon with 5 years of experience and you'll hear almost the same answer, echoed with a knowing smile. Fatigue is nowhere to be found when you're standing at the operating table, heart racing in sync with the steady hum of monitors, your gloved hands dancing under the sterile glow of fluorescent lights. The beam of the headlamp cuts through the darkness like a lighthouse piercing the fog, revealing the intricate mysteries of the human body in striking detail. The precise movements of your instruments, more delicate than a jeweler's touch. But when the last suture is tied and the operating room falls silent, fatigue resurfaces like an old friend you can't avoid. There's only one thing you yearn for in that moment, to sink into the warmth of your own home, where the scent of coffee lingers and familiar voices carry through the air like a soothing melody. You long to settle into a favorite chair, letting the tension drain away, and then, finally, to close your eyes and let sleep envelop you while the laughter of your children and the gentle murmurs of your spouse fill the quiet spaces around you. In that stillness, you feel the truth wash over you. Here, you are truly alive, and there, surrounded by those you love, you find genuine happiness. The night had been relentless, but George's work was done for now. He stretched, feeling the knots in his back loosen just a bit as he inhaled the fresh scent of morning. He allowed himself a moment to savor the quiet, his gaze resting on the hues of pink and gold creeping into the sky. His phone's sudden trill pierced the stillness, startling him. He fished it out of his pocket, blinking at the bright screen. Leslie's name flashed at him, and with a sigh he swiped to answer. "Hello, Leslie. Why are you up so early?" he asked, his voice calm but weary. He'd expected at least another hour or two before the inevitable demands of the day began. "Aren't you happy to hear from me?" Leslie's voice crackled through the receiver, her laughter bright but with an edge he couldn't quite place. "Of course I'm happy," George replied, trying to match her tone. "Just surprised by the early call. Everything okay?" "Oh yes, just woke up and couldn't get back to sleep. Thought I'd see how my husband is doing after yet another long night." Her words were tinged with something just shy of sarcasm, but George chose to ignore it, at least for now. "You know how it is," he murmured, glancing out at the streaks of dawn stretching across the horizon. A few more stitches, a few more hours of keeping people together. Not much time to rest. "Well, you're doing what you love," she replied quickly, almost dismissively. "And I'd hate to be the one to keep you from that." George exhaled more loudly than he'd intended and leaned against the wall. They'd had this conversation too many times before, always circling around the same points. He wanted to be the husband she'd married, but somehow that man seemed like a distant memory, obscured by the relentless march of their daily lives and Leslie's ever-present criticism. Leslie had been bright and carefree when they first met, her laughter lighting up any room they entered together. She was in school, full of dreams and ambitions, when George had fallen for her. He had been her rock, her protector, the one who made her feel safe. But things changed after the wedding. He wasn't sure when it had started, but slowly, her sparkling charm had given way to something sharper, more cutting. He remembered their first argument, the way her voice had risen, her face flushed with anger over something so trivial he couldn't even remember it now. Since then, little things had set her off, and he had grown used to walking on eggshells around her, trying to avoid the inevitable explosion. "George?" Leslie's voice pulled him back to the present. "Are you even listening to me?" "Sorry, He hesitated, feeling the weight of words he would never say. "I'm just tired, Leslie. It's been a long night." There was a pause on the other end, as if she were contemplating what he'd said, or perhaps waiting for him to say more. But George remained silent, unwilling to open the door to another argument. There was an elephant in the room as well, an unresolved tension that gnawed at their marriage with relentless persistence. Children, or the absence of them, had become another fault line in George and Leslie's fragile relationship. Shortly after their first anniversary, George had tentatively brought up the idea, picturing a little one to complete their family. But each time he raised the topic, Leslie shot it down with the same unwavering resolve. "Absolutely not," she would say, her voice clipped and final. "I'm not about to ruin my figure with childbirth, George. Not now, anyway. There's always time for that." At first, George had nodded, hoping she might change her mind with time, but each year was the same. He tried to hide his disappointment, but Leslie was quick to notice the sadness clouding his gaze. And so, eventually, he stopped asking. Leslie, accustomed to having her way since childhood, wielded her ability to say no like a weapon. She could dismiss his suggestions, his desires, with an ease that was both impressive and infuriating. Today, she had called him for no other reason than to wield that power yet again. But this time, George wasn't going to give in. "Listen, Leslie," he said, his tone resolute. "Tomorrow we're going to my parents' anniversary celebration. 40 years together. It's not up for discussion." "George, I don't see why I need to be there," she replied with an irritated huff. "It's your family's thing, not mine. You go and I'll have lunch at the cafe with Sandra." "Not this time. No cafe, Leslie. I can't talk right now, but we'll discuss it properly when I get home. And I expect you to come with me tomorrow." When George returned home, he found Leslie lounging on the sofa flipping through a magazine. She didn't even look up as he entered, but he knew she was stewing. He set his bag down and took a seat across from her, bracing himself for the conversation that was sure to come. "I can't believe you're dragging me into this," she said finally, looking up with a scowl. "I mean, really, George. Last month I missed the movie premiere because of some family obligation, and 3 months ago we were supposed to take that vacation, but you had those emergency calls, and I ended up alone. Again." George leaned back, sighing. "Then get a job, Leslie. You won't have time to be bored." "Oh, you're so interesting," she scoffed, crossing her arms. "I dropped out of school for you. You're the one who wanted us to be together all the time." "No," George replied with a weary smile. "You did that for yourself. Because you couldn't bear to put in the effort to finish your degree. You knew who you were marrying, and I thought I did too." Leslie's face flushed, but for once she had no quick retort. They sat in silence, each of them unwilling to break the tension hanging in the air. Finally, George rubbed his eyes and stood up, the fatigue of the long day weighing on him heavily. "All right, Leslie," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm exhausted. I need some sleep. But tomorrow we're going to my parents' anniversary together. Please, just try to understand how important this is to me." She didn't respond, merely turning her gaze back to her magazine, pretending to read as if she hadn't heard him. George knew better than to expect a change of heart overnight, but tomorrow, he hoped, might at least remind her of what family meant, even if only for a day. The next day, the drive to George's parents' house was marked by silence. George could sense Leslie's irritations simmering beside him, but he held his tongue, focusing on the road. He'd forgotten to pick up flowers for his mother, and knowing Leslie's mood, he didn't want to test her patience. So as they arrived, he parked the car and turned to her. "Could you go ahead? I need to get flowers for Mom. I'll just be a few minutes behind." Leslie rolled her eyes but didn't argue, slamming the car door a bit harder than necessary as she walked toward the house. George watched her go, exhaling before heading to the florist. As Leslie reached the doorstep, she was greeted by Carmen, George's mother, whose warm smile was as inviting as ever. Carmen enveloped her in a tight hug, pulling her close. "Leslie, darling, so glad you're here." Leslie managed a tight smile. "Thank you for allowing me," she replied, her voice tinged with sarcasm. Carmen tilted her head, giving her a scrutinizing look. "Is everything okay, dear? Did you and George have a little disagreement? You seem tense." Leslie shook her head, trying to dispel the scrutiny. "No, nothing like that. I'm just not feeling too well today." "Oh, you poor thing," Carmen cooed, her face softening with concern. "Come inside. We'll take good care of you. Michael," she called over her shoulder, gesturing to her husband. Michael, who had been dozing off in an armchair in the living room, slowly got to his feet and approached Leslie, offering her a gentle smile. He was tall and stoic, with a calm demeanour that belied his strength. He'd always been supportive of their marriage, though Leslie sometimes suspected he saw through her facade. "Leslie, good to see you," he said, extending a hand. "Where's George?" "He's coming. He forgot to pick up the flowers, so he's taking care of that now." Leslie forced a smile, injecting a hint of sarcasm. "I suppose he's a decent man for remembering at all." Carmen laughed, waving a hand dismissively. "Oh, why bother with flowers? We're just glad you're both here." Leslie offered no reply, her gaze drifting around the cozy living room adorned with family photos, each a reminder of the years George's parents had spent together. She wondered what that kind of steadfastness felt like. Despite the warmth and welcome around her, she felt like an outsider, unable to shake her mood. Moments later, the front door swung open, and George entered with a bouquet of burgundy roses in hand. The deep red petals looked lush and velvety, a stark contrast to Leslie's sour expression. George beamed as he approached his mother, extending the flowers to her. "Mum, happy Ruby anniversary," he said, pulling her into a warm embrace. He then turned to his father, embracing him too. "Happy anniversary, Dad." "Thank you, son," Michael replied, clapping him on the back. Carmen's eyes sparkled as she took the bouquet, inhaling the rich fragrance. "Oh, George, they're beautiful. You always know how to make your old mom happy." She grinned, patting his cheek affectionately. Leslie watched this exchange, a tightness forming in her chest as she took a seat at the dining table, feeling disconnected from the warmth that surrounded her. She poured herself a glass of wine, the dark liquid swirling in the glass, a temporary solace as she took a long sip, hoping it would ease the discomfort gnawing at her. Meanwhile, George chatted animatedly with his parents, clearly enjoying himself. His laughter filled the room as he shared stories from work and reminisced about family memories. Leslie tried to join the conversation but found herself unable to relax, her gaze drifting to George's easy smile, the way his parents leaned in to listen, their faces radiating affection. It was a world she felt estranged from, even as she sat at their table. As they settled into the meal, Carmen leaned over and squeezed Leslie's hand. "I know you're not feeling your best today, but we're glad you're here with us, dear. Family is what counts, after all." Leslie mustered a half smile, nodding in agreement but feeling the words ring hollow. "Yes, of course." George turned to her then, noticing her somber expression. He gave her hand a quick squeeze, his voice gentle. "Thanks for coming, Leslie. I know this isn't your ideal Saturday, but it means a lot to me." She pulled her hand away, offering him a curt nod. "It's fine, George." He studied her for a moment, a hint of sadness flickering in his eyes before he turned back to his parents, resuming the conversation. The rest of the meal passed in a haze, punctuated by the clinking of glasses and the soft murmur of laughter that seemed to swell around Leslie, but never quite reached her. The evening had been a blend of nostalgia and quiet warmth, with George savouring every moment as he sat between his parents. The laughter had died down, and they were finishing dessert when George stood, raising his glass with a soft smile on his face. He looked at his parents, his gaze tender and full of gratitude. "Mom, Dad, once again, happy anniversary," he began, pausing as he caught his father's eye. "There's something I've wanted to say for a while, and I think today is the perfect opportunity. On this special day, I want to thank you both from the bottom of my heart." Michael, his father, gave him a puzzled look. "For what, son?" he asked, curiosity etched on his face. George took a deep breath. "For making one of the best decisions you could have ever made 32 years ago. For taking me out of a place nobody wants to end up, an orphanage. Thank you for making my dream come true, for giving me a family." His voice grew steadier, and he glanced around the room. "Thanks to you, I've always had everything one could dream of. I've had things that others often take for granted. I've had happiness. You're the best parents anyone could ever ask for." The room fell silent, a wave of emotion washing over everyone. Carmen's eyes shimmered with tears as she discreetly dabbed them away with her napkin. She had always known that adopting George was one of the most important choices she'd ever made. But hearing his words now, knowing how much it meant to him, filled her with a profound sense of pride and joy. Leslie, however, let out a surprised huff, followed by a quick cough that broke the quiet. She stared at George, her expression a mixture of shock and something else he couldn't quite place. Michael turned to her, concerned. "Leslie, are you all right?" he asked, rising slightly, but she held up a hand to stop him. "I'm fine," Leslie replied, her tone clipped. She turned to George, her eyes narrowing. "It's just that it turns out I don't know much about my own husband." She paused, looking around the table before settling her gaze on Carmen. "Carmen, do you think it's okay not to tell your spouse the most intimate secret about yourself?" Carmen's face flushed, a mix of surprise and discomfort at Leslie's tone. She opened her mouth to speak, but George interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "Leslie, that wasn't a secret I kept from you. It's simply something I never thought would matter to you." He glanced at her, his expression pained. "This was a part of my life long before we met. I didn't think it was something that would change how you see me." Leslie scoffed, setting her glass down with a sharp clink. "Not something that would change how I see you. George, marriage is built on trust and honesty. How could you not think this was important enough to share?" George looked down, his fingers tightening around the stem of his wineglass. "I never wanted to hide it from you," he said quietly, searching her face. I guess I didn't know how to bring it up. And I never expected you to react like this." Michael cleared his throat, stepping in with a gentle but steady tone. "Leslie, we didn't adopt George to give him some kind of secret to hide. We did it because he was our son from the moment we saw him. Carmen and I have never once regretted that decision, and we're proud of the man he's become." The room fell silent as Carmen leaned forward, her voice calm yet firm. She knew this conversation had the potential to shatter the fragile peace that had always lingered between George and Leslie, but she was determined to make her point. "You see, Leslie," Carmen began, her eyes kind but unyielding, "in our family, we don't dwell on George's adoption. He's our son. End of story. It doesn't matter how he came to be part of this family. What matters is that he grew up to be the man he is, the man you married." Leslie clenched her fists, shooting a glare at George. "So I'm supposed to just accept that I know nothing about my husband's past? And after this, you still expect me to have kids with you?" Her voice grew louder, laced with rising panic. "How do I know what kind of genes our kids might inherit now? What if your real parents were raging alcoholics or worse? Do you even realize the position you've put me in?" George's face tightened with confusion and hurt, and he reached over, lowering his voice. "Leslie, calm down. You're overreacting." Leslie pulled away, her eyes flashing. "Overreacting? Don't you get it? I don't know who you are, George. I don't know who your parents were or where you came from. My friends all have husbands with respectable backgrounds, and now I'm supposed to accept that mine's an orphan without family or roots." George looked stunned, as if she had slapped him. "Leslie," he said slowly, disbelief colouring his words, "my family is right here. I don't understand why this matters so much to you." "Don't call me honey," Leslie spat, her words sharp as glass. She turned her gaze to Carmen, a mixture of resentment and confusion in her eyes. "How am I supposed to face my friends now? How do I explain this?" Carmen, unable to stay silent any longer, placed a hand on the table, steadying herself. "Leslie, I'm so sorry you had to learn about this today. Maybe George should have told you sooner. But does this revelation really change everything for you?" She looked directly into Leslie's eyes, her expression resolute. "Is George suddenly a different person because of where he came from? Are you suggesting that growing up in an orphanage somehow makes him less of a man?" The silence that had settled was brief, Leslie's expression hardened, as if she had summoned fresh determination. She wasted no time, picking up where she had left off, her tone now colder and more deliberate. "I just want to make myself clear," she began as she looked directly at George. "In my family, we value purity. I come from a pure lineage, with no questionable backgrounds, no surprises. I had every reason to expect that my husband would offer me the same." George's jaw dropped, disbelief and shock warring across his face. "Leslie, what are you talking about? What do you mean by purity? Are you suggesting that being adopted somehow taints me?" She lifted her chin, undeterred by his reaction. "I believe that our bloodlines matter. Who we are comes from our roots, our heritage. You didn't tell me about your background, George, because you probably knew it would be a problem. I value eugenics, creating a healthy, untainted lineage. Racial purity isn't something to be ashamed of. It's a way to ensure the best for future generations." Carmen's face drained of colour, and she gasped, clutching her husband's hand. "Leslie," she began, her voice shaking, "do you even hear yourself? Do you realise what you're saying?" Leslie's eyes never wavered. "Yes, I do. I have strong values, and I'm not ashamed of them. If I'm going to bring children into this world, I want them to come from good, strong stock. I can't afford to take risks with my own children's future, and this isn't what I signed up for." George rose from his chair, a mixture of anger and heartbreak in his eyes. Leslie looked up at him and asked, "Do you know anything about your parents? For all we know, they could have been criminals, addicts, or worse. You can't expect me to accept that kind of risk without question." Carmen rose then, her hands trembling but her voice resolute. "Leslie, we accepted you into this family without question. We welcomed you as one of our own. But I cannot stand by and let you belittle my son, our son, because of your misguided beliefs." The rest of the evening was ruined, and the couple left in silence, each choosing a separate path to avoid another argument. George felt the weight of the unresolved tension pressing down on him, so he decided to spend the night at work rather than go home to an empty, hostile space. As he made his way to the hospital, he wrestled with a mix of frustration, hurt, and lingering disbelief. Once there, he settled into the on-call room, but sleep remained elusive. His mind was a relentless reel of everything that had gone wrong lately, and he wondered what would happen next. Would they work things out? Or was this the beginning of the end? At one point, he sat up and rubbed his tired eyes. The fluorescent lights in the hallway flickered slightly, casting eerie shadows that only added to his unease. He heard the quiet hum of the night shift, punctuated by the occasional beep of monitors and hushed conversations between the nurses. "Hey, Dr. Brooks," a nurse said softly as she passed by, noticing him through the open door. "Couldn't sleep." George forced a faint smile. "Something like that," he replied, running a hand through his hair. "Quiet night," she nodded. "Yeah, for once, no trauma cases and no surgeries scheduled for the morning. You should try to get some rest." "I'll give it a shot," he said, though he knew it was futile. George hadn't slept all night, his thoughts circling around the argument with Leslie. "Good morning, Dr. Brooks." A cheerful voice pulled him out of his thoughts. Susie, one of the younger nurses, greeted him with a bright smile. "Good morning, Susie. How's everything in our kingdom?" George replied, trying to sound lighter than he felt. "Everything's calm," she said playfully, giving him a wink before hurrying off to her duties. George watched her go and sighed, deciding that maybe a cup of coffee would help. As he walked down the corridor toward the break room, something caught his attention. A small sniffling sound. He glanced around and spotted a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing in the hallway, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. He knelt down, trying to look as friendly as possible. "Hi, I'm George. What's your name?" The girl sniffed again, her eyes puffy and red from crying. "Hi," she mumbled. "I'm Katie. I'm looking for my bird. It's a magical bird and I lost it, and now my wish won't come true." Her voice wavered, and tears began to spill down her cheeks again. "Well, Katie, we have to find your bird then. I can't let a magical bird stay lost, now can I? But first," he said, tilting his head and offering a gentle smile, "can you tell me how you got here?" Katie nodded, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her hospital gown. "I'm here for a treatment. My chest hurts, and my mum said they're going to make the pain go away." George felt a lump form in his throat. He knew where this little girl had come from, the pediatric heart surgery department. His mind briefly wandered to the irony. Here was this innocent child facing something so terrifying, and yet she was only worried about her magical bird. "Your mum is right," George said softly. "The doctors here will do everything they can to make your pain go away. But in the meantime, we need to find that bird so your wish can come true." Katie's eyes brightened just a little as she nodded, and George took her hand, leading her down the corridor. As they walked, George's thoughts drifted. This child, with her innocent belief in magic, reminded him of the simple joys in life, something he had been missing for a long time. As they rounded the corner, a nurse from the pediatric department spotted them. "Dr. Brooks, where have you two been wandering off to?" she asked, raising an eyebrow but smiling kindly at Katie. "We're on an important mission," George replied with a grin. "Katie's magical bird has gone missing, and we need to find it." The nurse knelt down to Katie's level, her tone warm and reassuring. "A magical bird, huh? That sounds important. Where did you last see it?" Katie wiped her eyes again, thinking hard. "I had it when I was waiting with my mom. I think it fell when I was sitting in the big room." The nurse nodded. "I'll tell you what, why don't you and Dr. Brooks check there, and I'll look around too. We'll find that bird in no time." Katie gave a small smile, still sniffling, but her spirits seemed to lift as they made their way back to the waiting area. Her sudden shout jolted George from his thoughts. "There it is!" she cried, her tiny legs moving swiftly across the room. George watched, a mix of curiosity and surprise rising in his chest as she bent down and picked something up from the floor. She beamed as she held it up for him to see, a small, delicate origami crane folded with care. George felt his heart skip a beat. His eyes locked on the familiar paper bird, and a whisper escaped his lips before he could stop it. "It can't be." Katie, her excitement evident, tucked the paper crane carefully into her pocket, unaware of the storm brewing behind George's calm exterior. He stood frozen, staring at the spot where the bird had fallen, his mind reeling with a mixture of disbelief and memories that had long been buried. "Wait, Katie," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. Can I see your bird one more time?" Katie looked up at him, her innocent smile glowing as she reached into her pocket and pulled out the crane. She placed it gently in George's hand, her eyes trusting and wide, as if she sensed that this small paper bird held some kind of magic beyond her wish. George took the crane in his hands, his fingers trembling as he turned it over. The paper was creased with the familiar folds he remembered from so long ago, but it wasn't just the shape that struck him. It was the tiny signature dots on the wing. 3 delicate, faded dots placed just where he had seen them before. His chest tightened as the realization sank in. It was the same crane. Memories flooded back, crashing over him like a tidal wave. He was no longer standing in a hospital corridor. He was a boy again, sitting on a worn-out bench in the orphanage courtyard. Aunt Nancy, the kind and warm-hearted janitor, would sit beside him during her breaks, always with a fresh paper crane in her hands. She'd fold them with nimble fingers and dot the wings with 3 ink spots, always telling him the same thing. "One day, George," she'd say, her voice soft and full of hope, "you're going to be the happiest boy in the world." Aunt Nancy had been his first real friend, the one who saw him not as just another orphan, but as a boy with potential and promise. She had a knack for noticing when he felt low and always knew just what to say to lift his spirits. She would bring him small gifts, a piece of candy, a little trinket, And, more than anything, those paper cranes. Each crane she folded seemed to carry a piece of her heart, and she would pass them to him with a smile, placing the delicate birds into his hands as if they were treasures. He could still hear her words as clearly as if she were speaking them now. These cranes, George, are messengers of hope. They carry dreams and wishes on their wings, and each one is a promise that tomorrow will be better. Her hugs were always warm, her smile so genuine it brought tears to her eyes. She had been the one to comfort him when the loneliness of the orphanage walls became too much to bear. She wasn't just a janitor to him, she was a lifeline, a ray of warmth in a cold, uncaring place. And the cranes, those little paper birds, were her way of telling him that one day, his world would change. George's heart warmed as he held the crane, the weight of those memories settling over him like a familiar blanket. He could almost feel Aunt Nancy's arms around him, hear her soothing voice in his ear, whispering promises of a brighter future. But why was this crane here, in Katie's hands? "Katie," George asked gently, his voice just a whisper, "where did you get this bird?" But before she could answer, George saw her eyelids flutter, her face paling as her legs buckled beneath her. He moved with instinctive speed, catching her just before she hit the ground. Cradling her in his arms, he felt her little body go limp, and his heart raced with urgency. "Call the ER! Now!" he barked as he sprinted down the corridor, carrying Katie close to his chest. Nurses and doctors stepped aside as he passed, sensing the urgency in his voice and the resolute set of his face. He gave rapid instructions, his mind moving faster than ever, knowing each second counted. By the time he reached the ER, a team had assembled, and George was already issuing orders. "Prepare the OR. We need to stabilize her immediately." He gently placed Katie on the gurney, his mind focused on the task ahead. The operation stretched into hours, the hospital lights glaring down as George and his team worked with precise movements, each one a battle to save Katie's fragile heart. Finally, the monitors beeped steadily, signaling a stable heartbeat. George sighed with relief as he stepped back, knowing they had managed to pull her back from the brink. Outside in the hallway, Irene sat waiting, her face pale and her hands clenched tightly together. She looked up as George emerged, the question evident in her eyes before she could speak. He pulled off his mask, allowing a smile to spread across his face as he approached her. "You must be Katie's mom. She's strong," he said, his voice full of warmth and reassurance. "Katie's heart is beating well, even better than before. She made it through just fine." Irene let out a shaky breath, her eyes filling with tears. Without thinking, she stepped forward and hugged him, a mixture of relief and gratitude flooding through her. George returned the embrace, holding her gently as she sobbed into his shoulder. "Thank you, Doctor. Thank you so much," Irene whispered, pulling back to wipe at her eyes. George reached into his pocket and produced the paper crane. He held it out to her, a soft smile playing on his lips. "Katie will probably want this back when she wakes up." Irene took the crane, chuckling through her tears as she examined it. "She was so worried about this little bird," she murmured, her fingers brushing over the delicate folds. "It means the world to her. And to me." George hesitated, then reached into his pocket again, producing an identical paper crane. He held it out for Irene to see, watching as her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. She glanced down at the crane in her hand, and then back to the one George was holding, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make sense of it. At first, she thought he was playing a trick on her, but when she checked, the crane Katie had held was still in her hand. She then reached for the crane in George's palm, flipping it around to examine it closely. Her eyes widened as she spotted the same 3 dots on the wing, identical to the ones on Katie's crane. "How?" she stammered, her gaze flicking between the 2 cranes. "How can you have the same paper crane?" George smiled, a warmth filling his eyes as he looked at her. "It's a long story, but I think you know part of it already. Does the name Aunt Nancy mean anything to you? Irene gasped, covering her mouth. You went to the same orphanage? George nodded and smiled. Irene's face lit up, a mixture of joy and disbelief. I can't believe it. It's incredible. What are the odds? George shrugged, his own heart still reeling from the coincidence. 1 in a million, I guess. Irene's gaze was distant as she recalled the memories. She had this way of making you feel special, didn't she? She would always tell me that I was going to be okay, that I had something important to give to the world. I didn't believe her then, but she never seemed to doubt it. They shared a quiet smile, and George felt a warmth spreading through him. It's funny, he said, shaking his head. I don't remember seeing you there. I mean, I was always running around, climbing trees, getting into trouble. I would have thought I'd remember someone like you. Irene chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling with amusement. That's because I was the quiet one in the corner, the one with the sketchbook or a stack of books. I never did much running around, and I wasn't exactly the loud type. George's face lit up with recognition as the pieces fell into place. Wait a minute. The girl in the corner? He looked at her, suddenly remembering a quiet figure who would sit by the window, drawing or reading, seemingly lost in her own world. That was you, wasn't it? The quiet girl who was always sketching. Irene laughed, nodding as a wave of nostalgia washed over her. That was me. I remember watching you and thinking how fearless you were. You were like a whirlwind, always climbing something, always finding some adventure. I never imagined I'd meet you again, especially like this. They stood in a moment of shared disbelief, the past bridging the distance between them in ways neither could have anticipated. George shook his head, still blown away by the coincidence. Of all the people in the world, he said, his voice filled with awe, and we both ended up here, connected by those cranes Aunt Nancy gave us. Irene's smile faded, a sadness settling over her face. She hesitated before speaking, her voice growing soft. George, there's something you should know. Aunt Nancy, she passed away a few years ago. The news hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment he was speechless. She's gone? He whispered, the words barely leaving his lips. Irene nodded, looking down at the crane as she spoke. I ran into her once in a grocery store, maybe 3 years ago. We talked for a while. She asked about my life, about where I'd ended up. I told her about Katie, about my work, and she seemed so happy. She told me she was proud of me. George swallowed hard, his heart heavy with grief but filled with gratitude. I wish I'd known. I wish I'd had the chance to thank her for everything she did. They shared a quiet moment, each lost in their memories of Aunt Nancy, the woman who had shaped both of their lives in ways they were only beginning to understand. George felt the weight of her loss, but also the warmth of her legacy. A legacy that had brought him and Irene together and given them both the strength to face whatever lay ahead. A few days after the surgery, George stopped by his parents' house, a bag of groceries in his hand. His mother, Carmen, greeted him at the door with a warm hug, and they settled into the kitchen, chatting quietly as she put away the items he'd brought. The conversation inevitably turned to George's situation with Leslie. Carmen placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Whatever happens, George, things are going to be all right. You're strong enough to get through this, she said, her tone gentle but firm. He nodded, appreciating her reassurance, though the weight of his marriage troubles still hung heavy. As they finished putting everything away, George thought it might be nice to share his recent encounter. You know, he started, a hint of a smile touching his lips. I bumped into someone from the orphanage a few days ago. She's kept one of Aunt Nancy's paper cranes all these years. Carmen's expression changed subtly, her eyes widening ever so slightly as she tried to mask her surprise. Did she now? She replied, forcing a smile as she busied herself with the cans in the pantry. How is she doing? She's doing well. She has a daughter now. A little girl named Katie, George said. Carmen murmured something to herself, barely audible. She had known exactly who he was talking about the moment he mentioned the crane, but she didn't elaborate, simply giving George another warm hug before he left. As he pulled into his driveway, George felt a mixture of relief and sadness. His parents had always been his anchor, but now he had to face the quiet tension waiting for him at home. The house felt strange, almost eerie in its silence. He called out for Leslie, but there was no answer, though he knew she was there. The television flickered in the living room. He walked in and found her on the sofa, staring blankly at the screen. He greeted her, leaning down to place a kiss on her cheek, but she turned her head, her face set in a stony expression. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice as cold as the winter wind. "Leslie, what's going on?" he asked, a pang of frustration mixing with the sorrow in his chest. "I'm your husband. I deserve to know why you're acting like this." She remained silent, her eyes fixed on the TV as though he wasn't even there. George sat down beside her, forcing himself to remain calm. "Look, I'm sorry for not telling you I was adopted. I should have told you sooner, I know that now. But I didn't think it would change anything between us." Leslie finally turned to face him, her gaze sharp and unyielding. "It's too late, George," she said simply, her tone void of warmth. There was an emptiness in her eyes that made his heart sink. He looked at her, realizing the truth he had been avoiding. "What do you want, then? Because if there's no moving past this, I don't know what we're doing anymore." She said nothing. George felt a strange sense of calm settle over him, an acceptance that they had reached the end of something that had never truly fit. He went to bed without another word, the weight of everything pressing down on him like a lead blanket. The next morning he tried again, hoping for a glimmer of connection, but Leslie was as distant as ever. She barely acknowledged him, and when he asked if they could talk, she brushed him off as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. That was the last straw. He felt the final thread of his patience snap, and as he walked out the door, he knew he wouldn't come back that night. He drove to the hospital, seeking solace in the familiarity of work. As soon as George reached the hospital, his phone buzzed. The head nurse was urgently calling him to an operation. He sighed, a strange relief washing over him. If he hadn't had that argument with Leslie, he might have been stuck in traffic, unable to make it to the hospital on time. In a surgeon's life, every minute could be decisive. Every second could mean the difference between life and death. He hurried into the operating room, scrubbing in, his mind focused solely on the task ahead. The surgery was complicated, but George thrived in this environment. The operation was over, and the patient was stable. George removed his gloves and mask, exhaustion weighing heavily on his shoulders. He made his way down the hallway, his legs dragging, and collapsed onto the floor at the far end, leaning his back against the wall. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the coolness of the tiles seep through his scrubs. At that moment, the door to one of the nearby wards opened, and Irene stepped out. She had been taking care of Katie and hadn't noticed George at first, but when she saw him sitting on the floor, his head resting against the wall, she approached quietly. "You just came out of surgery, didn't you?" Irene asked softly, her voice cutting through the stillness of the hallway. She crouched beside him, her eyes warm with understanding. George opened his eyes and looked up at her, nodding slightly. "Yeah, long one." Irene smiled gently. "Thank you, George, for everything you do. I know it's not easy, but it matters. You matter." Her words were simple, but they hit George like a wave of warmth, washing away some of the cold fatigue that had settled over him. He stared at her for a moment, taken aback by the sincerity in her voice. For a fleeting second, he imagined what it would be like if Leslie ever said something like that. Just a few words of appreciation, of gratitude. That was all he needed. And yet, those words had never come from her. But here, from Irene, they felt real. Irene must have noticed the tension in his face because she asked softly, "Is everything okay?" George hesitated. He wasn't one to open up easily, but something about Irene's presence made it easier. No, not really, he admitted, his voice quiet. My wife and we can't seem to find common ground anymore. We keep fighting over the simplest things, and I don't even know what we're fighting about half the time. Irene listened quietly, nodding as George spoke, her gaze steady and calm. When he finished, she sighed and leaned back against the wall beside him. I went through something similar, she said after a moment. Before I found out my husband was having an affair, he'd pick fights over nothing. He'd provoke me, make everything into an argument, and I couldn't figure out why. I thought it was just me, but it wasn't. George frowned, her words sinking in. It wasn't that Leslie was having an affair, he knew that much, but she certainly had a way of making a fuss out of nothing. Every little thing was blown out of proportion, and George was tired. Tired of the constant tension, the walking on eggshells, never knowing what would set her off. He couldn't live like this anymore. After a while, Irene stood up, giving George a soft smile. I hope things get better for you, George, she said gently, before heading back to Katie's room. George stayed there for a moment longer, her words echoing in his mind. When he finally pulled himself up from the floor, something had shifted inside him. He reached for his phone and, without overthinking it, typed out a message to Leslie. It's probably not going to work out for us anymore. I don't think I can be the husband you expect me to be. I'm tired of fighting, of coming home and wondering what's wrong today. I'm sorry. He hit send and stared at the screen, his heart heavy but resolute. He watched as the Messenger app showed that the messages were seen, but there was no immediate response. The silence felt like an eternity. Then, suddenly, his phone buzzed. A message from Leslie. I'm sorry. George blinked, reading it over. A pause, then another message came in. I'm sorry I overreacted. He chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. She's sorry she overreacted, not for what she said, he thought to himself. The distinction was sharp and telling. It wasn't a real apology. It was an acknowledgement of behavior, not regret for the hurt she had caused. For George, it was the final confirmation he needed. Leslie wasn't sorry for the way she treated him or for the years of tension she had inflicted. She was only sorry for how she had acted, not for the damage it had done. You were lucky you didn't have to deal with people much, he wrote next. If you did, it would be a total disaster. For the first time, he felt like he had spoken up, like he had finally pushed back against the years of emotional pressure he had endured. He wasn't afraid anymore. The weight of her manipulation was lifting, and with each word he felt freer. He wasn't expecting a response right away, but when his phone buzzed again, it wasn't a text. It was a call. Leslie's name flashed across the screen, but George didn't want to talk. Not now. He had said everything he needed to say, and the last thing he wanted was to be drawn back into an argument. He ignored the call, but she called again, and again, and again. The phone vibrated incessantly, but George refused to pick up. An hour later, he was walking through the hospital corridors when the last thing he expected happened. Leslie stormed through the entrance, her face flushed with anger, her eyes wild. She spotted him immediately and marched straight toward him, her voice already rising. "Are you seeing someone else?" she demanded, her tone sharp and accusatory. George was taken aback, his brow furrowing in confusion. What? No, of course not. What are you talking about? Then why are you acting so weird, George? Why are you suddenly trying to end everything like this? Her voice was loud, drawing the attention of nurses and patients nearby. George tried to answer, to explain that this had been building for a long time, but Leslie wouldn't let him speak. She continued shouting, her words tumbling over each other in a torrent of blame and accusations. "You're a coward!" she yelled. "You've betrayed me. I gave up everything for you, and this is how you repay me? You're nothing but a jerk, George. A selfish, heartless jerk." Her words were cutting, sharp as knives, but George felt strangely calm. This wasn't the first time she had attacked him like this, but today it was different. Today he was done. He no longer felt the need to defend himself. He simply stared at her, his expression steady and composed. "It's over, Leslie," George said quietly but firmly, his voice cutting through her tirade. That was all it took for her to snap completely. Leslie went off, her voice reaching a fever pitch as she hurled insults and accusations at him. Her anger filled the entire hospital corridor, and people around them stopped what they were doing to watch the scene unfold. With a dramatic flourish, Leslie declared, "This is exactly what I meant when I said blood mattered. Who knows whose offspring you are? You deserve nothing but orphan scum like yourself." She slammed the hospital door open and stormed out, leaving George standing in the wake of her fury. George let out a slow, exhausted breath. He hadn't realized how much emotional energy he had been expending just to keep things together. Now he was spent. Outside the hospital, George found himself wandering, his mind buzzing from the intensity of the encounter. His eyes fell on a man smoking by the entrance. Without thinking, he approached him. "Mind if I have one?" George asked, pointing to the cigarette. The man nodded, handing him one. George hadn't smoked in over 10 years, but right now it seemed like the only thing that would take the edge off. He brought the cigarette to his lips, fumbling with the lighter when a voice from behind him stopped him mid-motion. "You shouldn't do it, George. It's not worth it." He turned around and saw Irene standing there, her expression soft with understanding. She stepped closer, offering him a sympathetic smile. "I'm sorry for what you just went through," she said gently. George stared at her for a moment, the unlit cigarette still in his hand. He sighed, dropping his arm and handing the cigarette back to the man. "You're right," he said quietly. "It's not worth it." Irene nodded, her gaze steady. "You've been through enough tonight." George ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the day catching up to him. "You have no idea," he muttered. "It's been like this for so long. I don't even know why I put up with it for this long." They stood in silence for a moment, the cool evening air offering a brief reprieve from the intensity of the day. Irene glanced at him, her eyes filled with quiet empathy. He smiled faintly. For so long he had been fighting to hold on to something that had long since been broken. But now, with Irene's gentle encouragement and the clarity of his own heart, he knew that letting go was the only way forward. George never went back home. After everything that had happened, filing for divorce felt like the only path forward. His parents, Carmen and Michael, took the news with no surprise. Carmen had simply patted him on the back, her voice soft and reassuring. "You did your best, son." With the weight of his troubled marriage behind him, George found himself breathing easier. Time passed, and to his surprise, he was feeling a lot better than he expected. Work was no longer exhausting, and the fatigue that had clung to him like a shadow seemed to disappear. Maybe it had something to do with the constant texting throughout the day with Irene. Before long, their texting led to spending time together. What had started as simple conversations now turned into outings, moments filled with laughter and companionship. George couldn't help but feel wonderful in Irene's company. The more time they spent together, the more he realized how easy it was to be around her. One evening during one of their casual hangouts, George teasingly asked, "Should I consider this a date?" Irene smiled, a glint of playfulness in her eyes. "I guess it's about time," she replied, her laughter infectious. But as their laughter subsided, a comfortable silence settled between them, and a minute later, without even realizing it, they were holding hands. Almost 6 months had passed when George decided it was time for Irene and her daughter Katie to meet his parents. The moment Carmen and Michael laid eyes on Irene, they liked her immediately. Michael, who had always been the quiet type, suddenly transformed into a doting grandfather figure. He eagerly took Katie by the hand and led her around the house, proudly showing her his gardening accomplishments as though they were the greatest wonders of the world. After dinner, as the and Irene found themselves in the kitchen, tidying up the table and doing the dishes, their conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from what to Katie's recent milestones as they stood at the sink, You know, Carmen said casually, drying a plate with a dish towel, there's a secret George doesn't know. Irene's heart skipped a beat, her expression shifting to one of concern. She carefully asked, "Is it something I should know?" Carmen chuckled softly. "It's nothing bad. Actually, it involves you too." Irene felt her curiosity rise, and she set down the plate she had been washing, turning her full attention to Carmen. "Go on," she urged. Carmen leaned against the counter, her gaze far away as she began to explain. "When Michael and I first went to the orphanage to meet with the children, we didn't just want to adopt a boy. We had hoped to adopt both a boy and a girl." She smiled wistfully. "I had brought 2 paper cranes with me that I'd made before the visit. I always thought of them as symbols of hope." At the mention of the paper cranes, Irene's heart fluttered. Her breath caught as memories of her childhood at the orphanage flooded back. "That day," Carmen continued, "we met 2 children we fell in love with, George and a little girl who liked to sit quietly and draw. The janitor, a lovely woman named Nancy, was there as well. She helped us with the paperwork and told us she would keep an eye on the children while we got everything in order for the adoption." Irene's pulse quickened as Carmen's words unfolded. "The little girl," Carmen said, her voice soft, "was you, Irene. You and George were the children we wanted to adopt, but circumstances changed, and we ended up only being able to take George." By the time Carmen finished her story, tears had filled her eyes. Irene stood there, frozen in shock, fighting back her own tears. She hadn't expected to hear this, that the family she had crossed paths with so unexpectedly now had always been part of her story. Carmen reached over and gently wiped her eyes. "Whoever picked you up from the orphanage, I hope they gave you the life you deserved. But I couldn't be more amazed at the fate that brought us all back together after all these years." Irene could hardly speak, overwhelmed by the revelation that George's parents had wanted to adopt her, that Aunt Nancy had watched over her for so long. The paper cranes had connected their lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. That evening, George and Irene sat quietly on the porch, the air warm and filled with the sounds of the night. George, lost in thought, was the first to break the silence with a soft chuckle. Irene glanced over at him, smiling as she asked, "What's so funny?" George leaned back, a grin spreading across his face. "I guess Leslie was right," he said, shaking his head. "I really did end up with someone just like me." Irene laughed, but her laughter quickly faded as they looked at each other, their hands inching closer. And then, as if the whole world had stopped around them, they drew closer and kissed. A kiss filled with the weight of all the things left unsaid, of all the moments that had led them here. For the first time in a long time, everything felt right.